Hey, so you guys remember when INS Vikrant was commissioned back in September 2022? There was this huge hangama on Twitter. Some guy was saying that it's like the Maratha Navy was reborn, somebody else was talking about the Cholas, and the more sensible ones are pointing out that the East India Company's navy had a lot of impact on how the Republic of India's navy evolved. But the history of how superpowers have tried to control the Indian Ocean goes really far back, and it's one that requires us to really understand not just the history of India, but also of China. I am Anirudh Kanisetti, historian and author of Lords of the Deccan. Welcome to Thinking Medieval, where every week we tell you something new about our complex, innovative past. Always feel free to check out our research and citations below and join us in figuring out how to talk about our messy, bloody, dazzling history. So, for at least the last 100 years, Indian strategists have dreamt of dominating the Indian Ocean. The logic is that, hey, look at the shape of India. We're basically an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean, and we can control its gateways at the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Park Strait, and the Straits of Malacca. But this idea isn't really new, and it goes back very far in time. The Portuguese, for example, successfully seized Malacca in 1511 and Hormuz in 1515, less than 20 years after Vasco da Gama had first entered the Indian Ocean. But in the 1400s, less than a century before that, another great power, China under the Ming Dynasty, had visited and attacked the very same ports with enormous fleets of ships, nearly 250 in number. These floating cities carried thousands of people, from Africans to Arabs, Malayalis to Sinhalas to Bengalis. On them were translators, merchants, diplomats, veterinarians, soldiers, even a few kings. These expeditions, led by the Admiral Chang He, were the culmination of hundreds of years of globalization in the Indian Ocean. Let's explore them and see the earliest examples of how a world power can successfully execute a strategy across this amazing region. Polities across the Indian Ocean have been trying to cross it for war and trade for centuries. If you look at present-day Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka, there's evidence of armies and merchants crossing between them for almost 2,000 years, and they kept getting bigger and bigger in scale. Truly trans-regional expeditions began in 1017 to 1018, when the Chola Emperor Rajendra I may have attacked Kedah in present-day Malaysia. In 1022-23, his armies raided Bengal, sacking several towns and forts in present-day Andhra Pradesh and Odisha. And finally, in 1024-25, he claimed to attack a number of cities across present-day Indonesia and Malaysia: Kedah, Palembang, Pane, Jambi, and Lamuri. Now, we don't really know how successful all these attacks were. It's not easy to figure out logistics half an ocean away. Maybe Chola claims of raiding these cities were meant to signify a maritime conquest of the directions, or Digvijaya, on which he said lots more in this video here. Now, Chola projections of power seem to have led to temporary regime changes and compliance. In Bengal, they set up a dynasty called the Senas, who were Kannada speakers from South India. And in 1018, after one of Rajendra Chola's attacks, the king of Kedah sent a gift of gold for a temple in Nagapattinam, the premier Chola port on the Indian Ocean. Finally, after the 1025 raids in Southeast Asia, Tamil merchants set up a number of enclaves in the region. So let's step back a minute and look at the patterns here. First, targets were clearly selected based on commercial and geopolitical priorities. India's east coast and Southeast Asia were full of Indian Ocean players and situated at strategic points in trade networks. Second, once the Cholas had attacked these places and removed rivals, friendly regimes or agents were usually installed. But by the 1050s, the Cholas faced tremendous pressure in Lanka and the Deccan, drawing resources away from oceanic expeditions. They tried mediating in Kedah, which was then the gateway to the Straits of Malacca in 1060, but that was about it. 400 years later, another Indian Ocean power would find the resources to do what they did at much larger scale. The Ming Dynasty rose to power in China in the late 1300s, and by the early 1400s, they were looking out to the rest of the world. Previous Chinese dynasties such as the Sung and Yuan had already been interacting with the Indian Ocean world, sending out embassies and building connections. The Ming independently figured out the same basic strategic templates as the Cholas, but poured huge resources into it. They built a fleet including enormous ships hundreds of feet long, carrying over 27,000 soldiers and large quantities of provisions and fine trading goods, especially silk and porcelain. For context, here is what a Ming ship was like compared to a contemporary ship that the Europeans used to discover the Americas. In Sri Lanka and in Palembang, the Ming fleet, led by a Muslim admiral by the name of Chang He, ensured outright regime change, forcing rulers to pay tribute to the Ming emperor in person. In 1405, Chang He brought a stone tablet declaring Malacca, then a tiny unimportant port, a country, and a Ming garrison and government depot were established there. This gradually decreased the importance of Kedah, which was so important to the Cholas 400 years ago, as the entrance to the straits. This sort of state-directed colonizing activity was very new in the Indian Ocean world. Here's another example. In 1417, Chang He granted an official Chinese seal to the ruler of Kochi on the Malabar coast. He also set up a tablet on a nearby hill, declaring it the mountain that protects the country, thus making Kochi part of the Ming political landscape and allying with it against the rival kingdom of Kozhikode. Why? Because Kozhikode had been conquering the rest of the Malabar coast, monopolizing the sale of pepper. The Ming clearly did not see this as being in their interest, which is why they propped up Kochi as a rival to Kozhikode. And that same year, they bombarded Malindi on the east coast of Africa, forcing it to trade and exchange embassies with them. This made it an ally and once again the most important port in the region. There's this amazing confidence and understanding of geostrategy required to literally bend such distant polities and trade networks to their will. I should also tell you that Ming influence wasn't always destabilizing. In 1408, they ordered Java to seize all demands for tribute from Brunei and fine them heavily. But there was another, even more interesting case in India. In 1420, the young Sultan of Bengal, Jalaluddin Muhammad Shah, requested the Ming's help against the invading Sultanate of Jaunpur. In response, Chang He's deputy arrived with troops and imperial orders, commanding the Jaunpuris to cultivate good relations with Bengal, which they seem to have done temporarily. In subsequent decades, Bengal actually became so important to the Ming that by the 16th century they even compiled a Chinese-Bengali dictionary. And it wasn't just the Bengalis who were happy with the Ming. We know of dozens upon dozens of embassies sent to them from across the Indian Ocean, consisting of valuable gifts, large numbers of people, and even animals. That story about animals we'll get to in a future episode. So, what does all this tell us about the nature of power in the Indian Ocean? While regime change and the control of choke points are important, any superpower, like India wants to be, needs to incentivize local regimes to engage with them. Grand military gestures like the Cholas did are important, but there's a reason why so many Indian Ocean powers sent elaborate embassies to and engaged with Ming China in comparison to the Cholas. In a region as vast and diverse as this, filled with so many competing polities, the big stick must also be accompanied by a reliable carrot. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. For more videos that will make you think, follow us on all of our social media handles. You can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and at Connected Histories and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.